The most important thing to know about the new 2021 Mazda 3 turbo sedan and turbo hatchback is that these are not Mazda Speed 3s. The Speed 3 was Mazda's high-performance hatchback some years ago, and it was laser-focused at the Ford Focus ST, the WRX STI, and the Volkswagen Golf R. The big thing you'll notice about that set of competitors is that they had a lot of changes. They had a lot of braking upgrades, suspension upgrades, styling upgrades even. The Mazda Speed 3 had a huge hood scoop, for instance. And this generation of the Mazda 3 feels a lot more grown-up. So if you're looking for something that doesn't scream boy racer, but is still pretty quick, that's why you might want to take a look at the Mazda 3. Obviously, you should also look at the Mazda 3 if you're simply looking for the best looking entry in this segment. The Mazda 3 is beautiful, and even though we do have this black lip spoiler on the one that I'm taking a look at, it certainly has a more grown-up look and a more grown-up feel to a lot of those other performance options. On the downside, some performance shoppers will be upset that Mazda didn't really modify the 3 too much. So we still have the torsion beam suspension in the rear. They didn't upgrade it to an independent rear suspension. We have essentially the same brakes that we find in the regular all-wheel drive versions of the Mazda 3 and still relatively narrow tires. That's because rather than targeting this turbocharged 3 at something like a Volkswagen Golf R, which has taken a year off, it will be coming back very, very soon, they've instead decided to try and focus this as an alternative to a BMW 228i or an Audi A3. That's pretty tough talk from Mazda, of course, because I don't see too many shoppers that are looking at a BMW or a Mercedes or an Audi taking a look at a Mazda, although I certainly think that this has the looks to compete. We have full LED headlamps up front. These turn in the corners, standard in the turbocharged model. We get a blacked out grille, optional lip spoiler down there at the bottom, but it's done pretty subtly. Be sure and let me know what you think about the look down there in the comment section below. I think that the Mazda 3 is quite simply the most attractive mainstream compact sedan available in America. Of course, I'm talking mainly about the sedan because I do think that the hatchback looks a little peculiar. Let me know what you think about that in the comment section. It has to do with this area of the hatchback. We have a slightly rounded rear end, which I could probably live with, but we also get this really pinched in roof look here. So they've really pinched in the roof towards the rear, giving it this really aggressive slope on the side and this sort of wide-hipped rear end appearance. At 175.6 inches long, the hatchback is also shorter than the sedan. It's 183.5. And I think that helps the proportions in the sedan versus the hatchback as well. This hatchback is 8 inches longer than a Volkswagen Golf and 2 inches shorter than a Honda Civic hatch. I think that this profile is unquestionably more attractive than the current generation Civic hatch. Again, let me know what you think about that down there. But I think the biggest problem for the Mazda 3 hatch is actually the Mazda CX-30. It's the very closely related crossover, I guess you could say crossover hatch. When creating the CX-30, Mazda didn't simply lift the hatchback up and give it off-road body cladding like we find in the Subaru Crosstrek versus the Impreza hatch. Instead, that vehicle has a slightly different roofline, a very, very slightly tweaked interior, but 90% of the vehicle is the same. Most importantly, the CX-30 is also getting a turbo for 2021, and although we don't know pricing just yet, I expect that it's going to slot right between the sedan and the hatchback in the Mazda 3 lineup, just like the rest of the CX-30 lineup. As with the front, changes to the rear end styling are pretty discreet. We do have an extra wing on top, but it's certainly not as aggressive or as boy racer looking as the wing that we find in the Civic Type R. It's actually mounted right here on top of the tiny spoiler that you find on the regular Mazda 3 hatch. Aside from that, the rear end styling reminds me a little bit of perhaps the Lexus RX, which is not necessarily a bad thing to be reminded of. We have full LED tail lamps back here. This is a bit unusual in a mainstream compact vehicle where typically the turn signals and backup lights would be incandescent. But here, everything is an LED. We have the same gloss black trim at the bottom that we found up front, and then twin exhaust tips at the back. When you go in for a closer look, you'll notice one of the big reasons that this does not wear a Mazda Speed badge. We don't have any major changes to the suspension tuning, the wheels, the tires, the brakes, etc. This has the same brakes front and rear as the regular all-wheel drive version of the Mazda 3, which are slightly upgraded from the front-wheel drive version. These are 215 width tires as well, so these are considerably narrower than many of the competitive vehicles out there, even excluding sporty options. So if you were to take a look at something like a Honda Civic, you can find 225 width tires on it. If you take a look at a Civic Type R's tires, they're considerably wider than the ones that we find on this Mazda 3. Putting wider tires in the Mazda 3 would have meant some body modifications because wider tires, especially 235 or 245 width tires, simply wouldn't fit in these wheel wells or of course with the suspension constraints. Another thing very similar to the rest of the Mazda 3 lineup is the suspension tuning. So they didn't give this a rock hard, ultra firm, sporty suspension, so it's still relatively comfortable, easy for daily driving, but most importantly, we still don't have an independent suspension in the back. Instead, Mazda went with a semi-independent torsion beam suspension that's pretty similar to what we see in vehicles like the last generation Kia Soul. Under the hood, we find essentially the same 2.5-liter turbocharged engine that we find in the CX-9, the CX-5, the Mazda 6, and very soon the Mazda CX-30 as well. But Mazda had to make some changes to this 2.5-liter engine to make it fit under the smaller hood of the Mazda 3. The biggest change is that instead of using an air-to-air intercooler, this now uses a water-to-air intercooler because it's a little bit more compact. It was easier for them to package everything under, again, a smaller hood than we find in the CX-9. But power figures are essentially the same. This engine produces 227 horsepower when fed regular unleaded, or if you give it higher octane fuel, it'll produce 250. Torque comes in at 310 pound-feet of torque on regular unleaded and 320 on premium. The important thing to know here is that this engine is designed to operate safely and effectively on regular unleaded. The other important thing to keep in mind when talking about horsepower and performance of turbocharged engines like this is that when engines are designed to operate on multiple different grades of fuel and they reduce power for lower octane fuel, it's not an on-off switch. So it's not like you feed this 87 and bang, instantly you're going to get 227 horsepower. There are a ton of different factors involved here, especially outdoor temperature. So if it's a really hot day, say it's 120 degrees and you're in Death Valley and you're giving this regular unleaded, sure, you're going to be getting less power. But if it's a cold day and you fed it regular unleaded, you probably would be getting 250 on whatever kind of fuel that you could feed your Mazda 3. Versus the previous Mazda Speed 3, this gives you a little bit less power, but a whole lot more torque. 320 pound-feet of torque is an incredible amount of torque. Channeling all that to the ground is a standard 6-speed automatic transmission, the same 6-speed that we find in the rest of the Mazda lineup, and fuel economy comes in at 27 miles per gallon combined if you get the sedan, 26 if you get the hatch. That's just 1 mpg less than the non-turbocharged 2.5-liter engine. About that transmission, I have complained about Mazda's 6-speed automatic transmission in the past. I think it's a bit out of place in the CX-9, the CX-5, and the Mazda 6 as well. But honestly, things are a little bit different for the Mazda 3, or of course the CX-30, because in the compact segment or in the subcompact crossover segment where the CX-30 is trying to play, having a CVT or a dual clutch transmission is a little bit more the norm. So most of the competition to this is going to have either a 6 or 7-speed automatic transmission of some description or a continuously variable automatic transmission. So while I'm still not the biggest fan of this particular 6-speed automatic transmission, it is not as big of an issue for the Mazda 3 or the CX-30 as I think it is for the CX-9. Now, one important thing to keep in mind about this particular 6-speed automatic is that Mazda chose not to give us very aggressive starting ratios. The final drive ratio is not as low as I had expected, so final drive ratio plus first gear gives you an effective 12.3 to 1 as far as engine to the wheels. That is definitely not as aggressive as something like the Elantra Sport or upcoming Elantra N-Line at 14.2 to 1, or the BMW 228i, which Mazda says might be a direct competitor to this at 16.4 to 1. That's one of the reasons that you might want to take a look at some of those luxury options, those more aggressive gearing ratios that we find in modern 8, 9, or 10-speed automatic transmissions. The 8-speed that we see in that BMW 228i not only gives you a more aggressive first gear, it also gives you a higher final gear for better fuel economy on the highway as well. A number of years ago, Mazda decided to make a key change to their mission and also their product lineup. They decided that vehicles in their lineup wouldn't just compete with mainstream options like a Toyota Corolla or a Toyota Highlander or a Honda Pilot, but also premium or near luxury entries like the Mazda CX-9 trims that compete with the Acura MDX. That's arguably what's going on in the Mazda 3 as well. With this turbocharged trim, we have a few luxury features that we don't find in things like the Corolla or the Civic, etc., like a 2-position seat memory there. But we don't have quite the same kind of luxury content that we'd find in a full-on luxury brand. So we don't have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support on the driver's seat, and we still have a manual tilt telescopic steering column. Rather surprisingly, we also don't have a power passenger seat of any description in this top-end trim. And the price tag on this model is right around $35,000. When it comes to front seat comfort, giving this a score is a little bit tricky. I'm going to give this 8 out of 10 points because I do find these seats more comfortable than most mainstream compact sedans, but we don't have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, which is something that I might have expected at $35,000, especially for a vehicle that has more premium aspirations. This is theoretically trying to compete with not just the Acura ILX, But also, oddly enough, Mazda was saying a BMW 228i. I think that's a bit of a stretch, however. Jumping into the back seat, I have a reasonable amount of room with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have about an inch of legroom left, a little bit more if I really put my knees together, because the front seat back is definitely aggressively scalloped. Now, unfortunately, the design of the hatchback variant of the Mazda 3 really cuts down on rear seat practicality. The roofline that's really aggressively pinched in there means that if I'm sitting in this seat position, my hair is brushing not just the roof, but also the side sill right here. And that does make it a little bit less comfortable for adults, especially if you were to try and squeeze a few people across the rear. If I move over to the middle seat position, I can't sit upright there. My head actually has to crane over to one side. That's because the Mazda 3 hatch really doesn't have a lot of headroom. Depending on the seating position, it may be a little bit more than the Mazda 3 sedan, but it's not a huge improvement like you do find in some hatchbacks out there. Scooting all the way over to the right side where this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, my knees are just about touching the rear seat back. Generally speaking, one of the reasons to buy the hatchback over the sedan is going to be cargo capacity, and that's certainly true for the Mazda 3. We find just over 20 cubic feet of storage space back here. That's a notable improvement in space and in practicality versus the Mazda 3 sedan. That's likely one of the reasons that hatchbacks appear to be a little bit more popular in urban areas, because even though the vehicle is smaller on the outside, it has a bigger cargo area inside. But when we open the cargo area, you'll really notice that profile that was going on in the rear, where the roofline pinches in there towards the rear. That makes this a little bit narrower than many of the competitive hatchbacks that you might want to be comparing this to. And the cargo area is certainly not as square as the one that we find in the Volkswagen Golf. But this particular profile has a bit more impact, as I said before, on rear seat headroom. That's certainly one reason that you might want to get the sedan over the hatch. As with the outside, on the inside, this looks very much like the rest of the Mazda 3 lineup. We have a pretty standard-sized moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads. No panoramic moonroof is available. Up front, we have adjustable height shoulder belts, your choice of leather or leatherette upholstery, and they're two different interior colors. The top-end version that I'm driving in here has the option of the white Mazda leather or the black leather that we're taking a look at now. There are a decent amount of soft touch materials going on the front doors. This definitely has a much more premium appearance and more premium feel than the average mainstream vehicle that this is competing with. This feels a little bit more like perhaps something along the lines of a Lexus UX. The upper section of the doors and dashboard is a soft-touch injection molded component. We then have some stitched goods right there on the door and dashboard as well, helping dress things up a little bit. And then, as you'd expect out of a mainstream vehicle, harder plastics down there towards the bottom of the dash. The glove compartment is a fairly small slot-style compartment. I was not able to fit some of the larger tablet computers in there. Right between those passenger air vents, we see what looks kind of like an air vent, but that's actually just a styling element, giving this sort of an Audi 5000 vibe. Helping tie things together a little bit, we have a chrome band that runs from those passenger side air vents all the way over here to the dual zone automatic climate control. It even integrates with the climate control knobs pretty well. This is where we find the engine start stop button, the controls for the heated steering wheel, heated seats, etc. Ventilated seats are not available. Continuing up from there, we find more of that stitched material, and then we find the infotainment screen. This is not a touchscreen like we found in previous Mazda models, but it is a high-definition widescreen format, and it supports CarPlay and Android Auto integration, as you can see here. The Mazda infotainment software is supposed to be very intuitive, according to Mazda, but there are a few things that are not quite as intuitive as I'd like them to be. For instance, if you're trying to find a new station, whether we're on XM or AM, we have to go in here, click that menu option, rotate the knob around, find the station list, and then you can actually see all the stations the system has found, or you can use the tuner controls right there on the screen. It's just not quite as intuitive as a tune knob would be, or a touch screen, I have to say. Going back down the dashboard, we find a USB input right there under the dual zone automatic climate control, a storage area right there, two decently sized cup holders, a pretty traditional console shifter. There's a manual mode over to the left. We also have a sport toggle here, just sport and off. It's not a drive mode selector. Electric parking brake, auto brake hold, the control for that infotainment system, and then we find the volume and tuning and track forward backward knob over here. You toggle it side to side for track forward backward. Between the front seats, we have a padded center armrest. It slides back and then lifts out of the way to give us access to a moderately sized storage compartment. You'll certainly find a bit more storage space than some of the other alternatives, but we do have a second USB input that integrates with the infotainment system, so you can keep your smartphone here if you want to. A nice touch that we don't find in too many mainstream vehicles is that there is an available 360-degree camera view. There are three different views here. So that's the forward-looking view there. You can get a slightly wider angle view there as well. And then I can hit the button there again to see the sides of the vehicle. The view will also change if I put the car in reverse, as you can see. On the driver's side, there's an available heads-up display. This is one of the variety that's projected on the windshield rather than on a small sheet of plastic. The instrument cluster is Mazda's familiar partial LCD design, so we have a 7-inch LCD right here in the middle that's giving us the MPG readout, the fuel level readout here on the right, and then the speedometer. Helping make the design a bit more cohesive, there's a physical chrome ring that surrounds the speedometer, and that means that this display is not quite as configurable as some of the competition's LCDs. Engaging or disengaging sport mode doesn't change the look of the display, but we can get a more safety-centric readout where we have the safety system readouts there, digital speed at the top. We can also choose not to have anything in the middle or have the trip computer displayed there. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to talk about how the Mazda 3 Turbo drives just yet, so you will have to hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen and come on back for that video as soon as I can tell you what this is like out on the road. But very clearly, you can read between the lines and fill in some of the details here. The Mazda 3 Turbo is just a little bit heavier than the regular Mazda 3. It's about 100 to 150 pounds or so, depending on how you compare them. We have essentially the same size tires on both vehicles, the same brakes on both vehicles, and the suspension tuning is really similar. Mazda didn't give this some really aggressive sport suspension. We also have that very similar sporty interior, very similar to what we find in the regular version, however. So logically, the big difference is going to be how fast this goes 0 to 60, but again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. What we can talk about now is how much the Turbo will cost you. The Turbo sedan starts at $29,900. That's about $9,000 more than the absolute base version of the Mazda 3 sedan. But that's not the fairest comparison because that has a 2-liter engine and is front-wheel drive. The gap obviously narrows if you're talking about the sedan versus the sedan with all-wheel drive and the Turbo versus non-turbo. When we're talking about the hatch here, this started at $30,900. That is a pretty significant bump above the base hatch at $22,500. If you get carried away with options, this will top out at $35,420, or if you get the dealer-installed BBS wheels, just about $39,000 before destination. That puts the Mazda 3 Turbo hatch in kind of a tricky pricing category. It's not too far off entries like the Volkswagen Golf R, which last started at $40,400, or the Honda Civic Type R, which theoretically is $37,500 if you can find one for MSRP, or a BMW 228i Grand Coupe at $37,700. And oddly enough, Mazda would like us to think that this is a 228i or Audi A3 competitor. That's tricky, of course, because Mazda is not a luxury brand, but they're certainly trying to go more upmarket with every generation of their product. The interior certainly has what it takes to be considered a premium product. I would put this a little bit more in the lines of perhaps Cadillac or Buick than direct BMW or Mercedes competitor, but the interior is certainly more premium than what we find in the Honda Civic. This absolutely blows the Honda Civic out of the water, both in terms of interior and exterior design. I also think this is more attractive, generally speaking, than the new Golf R that we've already seen some photos of. And the same sort of thing goes when you compare this against the Toyota Corolla or the Hyundai Elantra or the Kia Forte. Those are definitely a lot more mainstream oriented. The materials quality, the design is not as attractive, not as premium as this Mazda 3. But is the Mazda 3 at the same level as a 228i or a Mercedes-Benz CLA or an Audi A3? No, I don't think so. Mazda doesn't really think so either. They just think that this is going to be a good value alternative to those luxury entries. That puts the Mazda 3 in this interesting never-never land between most mainstream options like the Corolla, the Civic, etc., and those more expensive luxury options. In my mind, the biggest competitor, especially for the Mazda 3 hatch, is going to be the Mazda CX-30, because I think the CX-30 is a little bit more attractive. I like the tweaks that have been made to the vehicle to turn it into a CX-30. The biggest of them is the roofline. The roofline in the CX-30 is not as pinched in the rear as we find in the 3 hatchback, and that means that the rear seats are certainly more comfortable, especially for adults. Even though on paper the 3 hatch and the CX-30 are really similar in terms of dimensions, the cargo area is almost identical in terms of cubic feet, the cargo area in the CX-30 is a little bit more practical. Personally, I think the CX-30 is also more attractive. I don't mind the body cladding on the sides. I don't mind the mini SUV looks. I think that it comes across as a really cohesive package. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there. But I think the biggest thing is that most likely the CX-30 is either going to be identical in price to the hatch or perhaps a little bit less expensive. So it's not really surprising that the CX-30 is outselling the Mazda 3 hatch in the United States. Of course, whether we're talking about the CX-30 Turbo or the 3 hatch Turbo or the 3 sedan Turbo, there really aren't very many direct competitors in the United States, and therefore I can kind of understand why Mazda was trying to pull out competition like a BMW 228i or an Audi A3, because they're probably about as close to this formula as you can find out on the market right now. The Golf R, the Civic Type R, the Forte GT, the Elantra N-Line, All of those vehicles are trying to be extra power with sportier driving dynamics, more of a sporty feel, sport seats, etc. Whereas this is definitely going after a different shopper, a more grown-up shopper, perhaps. But the equivalent, I guess, would say that college graduate that's graduated with a professional degree and they're somehow emerging out of college at age 30 and they're looking for a starter vehicle that has a more grown-up feel but has a little bit more oomph under the hood. Theoretically, that same kind of shopper that might want to go towards a BMW 228i, but they're looking to spend a little bit less money than BMW or Audi money. Awkward segue, everybody. I spent so much time researching the mainstream alternatives to the Mazda 3 and some of the luxury or near luxury options that Mazda was talking about in a presentation that I completely forgot about the Acura ILX and the Lexus UX. Those two options really make a lot of sense to compare against the Mazda 3, because the Mazda 3 sedan is, I think, prettier than the Acura ILX. It definitely feels more premium and more modern on the inside. It's right in the same price range as the ILX as well. It won't handle quite as well as the ILX. The ILX, I think, does handle better out on the road, but this is going to be significantly faster. And you could fix some of the handling complaints by putting different tires on this yourself aftermarket. Versus the Lexus UX, performance is in an entirely different world. This is significantly faster than that hybrid UX. Admittedly, the UX is going to get better fuel economy, but it's not going to be Prius level fuel economy, and I was a little bit disappointed by that. And of course, this has all-wheel drive. The UX doesn't really. It has that E all-wheel drive option. And of course, the ILX doesn't have all-wheel drive at all. If my money were on the line, I would certainly buy a Mazda 3 Turbo over the ILX and the Lexus UX. And I would also give a shout out here to the Mazda PR department that maybe you ought to be focusing a bit more on the Lexus and the Acura comparisons to the Mazda 3 than something like the BMW or the Audi. Does that kind of shopper actually exist? Let me know down there in the comments section below. I'm not entirely sure whether it does or whether Mazda is trying to create a new segment for themselves with the Mazda 3 Turbo. Either way, I actually love this car, but you'll have to wait until the full review comes out so I could talk a little bit more about how it drives. Be sure and come back at that date at the bottom of your screen. There's a date and time down there. Hit the subscribe button in the meantime. Be sure and check out the new merch store at aoamerch.com, and I'll see all of you later.